If you've received an IRS notice in the mail showing that you owe tax, penalties, or interest, you can often have those amounts removed, waived, or forgiven, and I want to show you how to do that. First, let's talk about how taxpayers get into trouble. It comes mainly from failing to file your income tax return on time or failing to pay the tax due on time, or both. Now, any penalties or interest are usually based on the amount of tax owed. So if you don't owe any tax or you're getting a refund, then there typically aren't any penalties if you file your tax return late. But if you do owe tax, one thing people don't realize is that penalties for failing to file your tax return are more severe than penalties for failing to pay. The penalty for individuals who file their tax return late is 5% of the unpaid tax per month, up to 25%. So if you owe $3,000 but you don't file an extension and you file 5 months late, that's 5% of the $3,000 times 5 months, or $750. Now let's say you did file your tax return on time, but you just haven't paid the tax. Penalties for paying late are 0.5% per month, up to 25%. So it accrues more slowly. So if you didn't pay the $3,000 for 5 months, that'd be $3,000 times the 0.5% penalty times 5 months, or $75. Sometimes people don't file their tax returns because they don't want to make the payment, but by doing this, you're just creating bigger problems because you can see that the $750 penalty from this example for failing to file is much greater than the $75 penalty for late payment. If you don't have the money to pay, one option is to sign up for an IRS payment plan, which will freeze any penalties. What you don't want to do is file an extension thinking that'll give you more time to pay the tax. An extension gives you an extra 6 months to file your tax return, but not to make any tax payments. The tax dollars are still due on tax day, and if you're self-employed, they're due throughout the year in the form of estimated tax payments. So if you were required to make estimated tax payments and didn't, you'll likely get a late payment penalty notice from the IRS. Now, before I talk about how to get those late penalties waived, I also want to mention that late filing penalties for S-Corps and partnerships or multi-member LLCs are fairly significant. The late penalty is over $200 per month per shareholder, maxing out at 12 months. And the per month amount increases with inflation. So if you have an LLC with 3 people and you're 12 months late filing the business tax return, the fee will be $220 times the 3 shareholders times 12, or $7,920. So I really want to emphasize the importance of filing your tax returns on time. Now, the good news is that the IRS knows we're human and they often let us off for the first offense through something called the first-time taxpayer penalty abatement. In a nutshell, you call the IRS and you tell them you want to have your penalty waived as part of a first-time abatement. They'll check to make sure you qualify by being in otherwise good standing with your tax returns and taxes for the prior years, and that you haven't used the abatement within the past 3 years. If that's the case, I've never had a client not have their penalties removed. And if the agent does give you a hard time, I recommend calling back and talking to someone else. If you prefer not to call, you can also fill out and send in Form 843, claim for refund and request for abatement. I've never actually gone this route because it's quicker just to get it done over the phone. And it's that simple. If you're being assessed a penalty for late filing or late payment, and if you haven't had another abatement applied recently, then they'll usually waive the penalties, and you can move on with your life a little lighter and a little happier. Now, I had a client where there was a late filing penalty. It was an S-Corp with 2 owners, so it was $210 per month at that time, maxed out at the 12 months, so $2,520. We called to have it waived, but the IRS wouldn't give it to us because they had already been granted an abatement in the year prior to that. Otherwise, it would have been forgiven. Luckily, that's not the end of the road. When you aren't eligible for the simple abatement, you can request that it be waived as part of something called reasonable cause. Now, this one isn't as much of a no questions asked type forgiveness. You have to show more documentation. If you can show that you intended to file or pay on time, but that you were delayed because of a good reason, then the IRS will waive the fee. The reasons they accept as acceptable include fires, natural disasters, or civil disturbances, inability to get records, death, serious illness, or systems issue that delayed an electronic filing or payment. Invalid reasons include reliance on a tax professional, lack of knowledge, mistakes and oversights, or lack of funds. In other words, you can't blame your CPA or tax preparer. This is why I always emphasize getting a basic level of tax education for yourself. Reasonable cause can be done over the phone, but I've had more luck with sending in a letter in which you want to highlight the efforts you made to report on time and accurately, your good compliance history, and the valid reasons that prevented you from filing. Now, there are entire trainings available on how to construct a good reasonable cause letter. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I will include links below, including a practice unit used by IRS agents on what they're supposed to look for. In the example I mentioned, in my letter, I tried to really play up COVID and how it impacted the family members' work and school schedules, and ultimately the IRS sent a letter showing that the tax penalty had been removed. If they don't approve your reasonable cause letter, you can always appeal, and I've heard some CPAs say that the appeals have a higher success rate than the initial reasonable cause application. The moral of the story is, don't just blindly pay the penalties assessed without knowing what they're for and without trying to have them removed first. It's almost always worth the phone call. Subscribe for more videos where I'll talk more about how to get your taxes and accounting on track in your reselling business. And check out @NotYourDadCPA on Instagram for more tips and behind the scenes. And come join my free Facebook group, Accounting for Online Sellers. Use the links below for more resources to help you optimize your tax situation and overcome the anxiety so you can focus on building your business profitably.